Well, it's our pleasure to have with us today the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life and the Pew Research Center, which really are two organizations that have gone a great distance in increasing the quality and quantity of the dialogue about religion in the public square. As someone who specializes in religious issues, it's been an incredible resource to me over the last 10, 15 years to be able to draw on the work of the Pew Forum as well as the Pew Research Center. And I have a personal appreciation for what they do. And we invited them here today because they've done some wonderful work on both perceptions of Muslim communities as well as the opinions and attitudes within the Muslim community. And we wanted them to talk a little bit about that here today. There will be a chance for asking some questions. So again, fill out your cards and we'll send them down to the center aisle. We'll have a little time for Q&A. Our first speaker is Dr. Scott Keeter, who's Director of Survey Research at the Pew Research Center. He is also President of the American Association for Public Opinion Research. His published works include books and articles in public opinion, political participation and civic engagement, religion and politics, American elections, and survey methodology. He attended Davidson College and received a PhD in political science from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He's taught here at George Mason University, Rutgers University, and Virginia Commonwealth University. And also with us is Gregory Smith, who's senior researcher at the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life. He specializes in survey research, religion and public opinion, religion in American politics, and Catholic politics. Dr. Smith holds a PhD in government from the University of Virginia, and his doctoral dissertation on the influence of priests on the voting behavior and political attitudes of American Catholics won the 2006 Aaron Wildavsky Award, which is given to the American Political Science by the American Political Science Association for the best dissertation in religion and politics. So it's our great pleasure and honor to have with us representatives from Pew Forum and the Pew Research Center. So, Scott.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you, Eric. It's a delight to be here. We're really grateful for the opportunity to take part in this very interesting event, and we hope that we can make a contribution to it by telling you a little bit about a study that we recently completed among the Muslim American population. Before I tell you some of the findings from it, though, let me give you just a 60-second capsule of who we are and what we do. The Pew Research Center is a nonpartisan, nonprofit, non-advocacy research center that has a goal of contributing unbiased information on important questions of public debate in the country. The idea for a Muslim American survey actually arose in a conversation between our president, Andrew Kohut, and the president of the Pew Charitable Trusts in the months following the London subway bombings of 2005. The idea was that we don't know very much about our own Muslim population here. Of course, the U.S. Census doesn't ask about religion. The Muslim American population is a relatively rare one. It is very diverse. It is very dispersed around the country. All of those things present significant challenges to survey researchers in trying to do a good job of characterizing a particular population. And so the idea was we need to know more about our own Muslim population so we can understand who they are, what they're thinking, what kinds of experiences they're having. And that led to the first study, which was conducted in 2007. I'm going to be speaking, and Greg is going to follow me in talking about results from our 2011 survey, which we completed this summer. Here are some details about the study. We interviewed 1,033 Muslim American respondents, adults. This was a national survey that covered the entire United States. We did our interviewing by telephone on both landline and cell phones, giving all Muslims in the country some chance of being included in the survey. And importantly, and something that had never been done in any kind of studies of Muslim populations in this country before, we interviewed not only in English but also in Arabic, Urdu, and Farsi in order to make sure that as much of the population as possible had a chance of being included. The content of this survey was very broad because, especially in 2007, we knew hardly anything about the Muslim American population from a scientific standpoint. We wanted to cast as broad a net as possible in terms of the content, and so we asked about demography, we asked about religious beliefs and practices, we asked about attitudes towards politics, foreign policy, and the like, as well as opinions about extremism. We're going to be talking here today more about the experiences that Muslim Americans have living in the United States, since that's much of the theme of the conference today. But let me first tell you just a little bit about who Muslim Americans are according to the study. First of all, it's a very much an immigrant group. Nearly two-thirds, 63%, are first-generation immigrants to the United States. And as you can see in the chart, 22% are third generation, that is, born in the United States of native-born parents, and 15% are second generation, that is, born here of parents who were born outside the United States. One of the very interesting things, and a key to understanding some of the other results that we'll be talking about, is the fact that Muslim Americans have achieved very high rates of citizenship. Among the immigrant Muslim American population, the 63% who have come to the United States, fully 70% say that they are now citizens of the U.S. When you compare that to non-Muslim immigrants to the United States at the same point in time, only about 47%, or just under half, have actually achieved citizenship. And so this is a population that has come to the United States relatively recently. A quarter of Muslim Americans actually have arrived in the United States in the past 10 years, and yet a very high percentage of Muslim Americans are citizens of the United States, and of course all who are born here are. Another thing that comes out of the study is, in some respects, how ordinary the Muslim American population is. We asked not only about a lot of things relating to politics and some attitudes that are interesting, but we also just asked about everyday life. And we found that there is a lot of similarity in terms of the percentage of Muslim Americans who do the kinds of things that we think of as sort of quintessentially American. We have a lot of TV watchers in the Muslim American population. 58% say they watch an hour or more of television nightly. That's very similar to the general public. Social networking. Muslim Americans are more active on social network sites, largely because they are younger than the American population. Watching college and pro sports, about half regularly do so. That's the same as in the general public. Video game playing is very similar. And there are 44% of Muslim Americans who say they regularly fly the American flag. That is lower than the general American public, but it's not too different from the American public if you take into account the age of the Muslim American population. In terms of attitudes, we find the Muslim American population very well integrated and happy with their existence, for the most part, in the United States. I don't want to go too far on this because we're going to share with you a number of findings that suggest just how difficult life is for Muslim Americans right now. But when you ask these broad summary questions, are you happy with the way things are going in your life? Are you happy with your communities? And even, are you happy, generally speaking, with the way things are going in the United States? You find majorities, in some instances, sizable majorities of Muslim Americans saying, yes, I am happy with all of these. This graphic shows that 82% say they are satisfied with the way things are going in their own lives. Only 15% say they're dissatisfied. That is significantly higher than you find in the general public. Similarly, 79% rate their community as an excellent or a good place to live, and relatively few say that it's only fair or a poor place to live. In terms of national satisfaction, we actually find a majority of American Muslims saying that they are satisfied with the way things are going in the United States. That is up significantly from the 2007 survey, and of course at the same time, the general public has become less satisfied with circumstances in the country, largely because of the way the economy has gone. We can talk more about this in the Q&A if you're interested, but in general, the survey paints a picture of a population that is pretty happy with its life circumstances here. Not to say that there aren't problems. Muslim Americans are facing the same kinds of economic difficulties that everyone else is, but in these broad summary measures, there's a lot of satisfaction. We also asked Muslim Americans in the survey how they think other Muslims who come to the United States think about assimilation. And a majority of them, 56%, told us that they think that most Muslims want to adopt American customs and become a part of the country, as opposed to only about 20% who say they think most Muslim Americans prefer to remain distinct. When you ask this question of the general public, what do you think Muslims who come to the United States want to do? Almost half of the general public says Muslims want to remain distinct, and only 33% say they think they want to assimilate. One of the key American values is the idea that you can get ahead through hard work. Muslim Americans, even more so than in the general public, endorse that idea. 74% say that if you work hard, you have a good chance of being able to get ahead. Only 26% say that hard work isn't a guarantee of success. Among the general public, only 62% see hard work paying off. And then, just as a summary of all of this, and before we segue to Greg's presentation of what Muslim Americans are experiencing day to day, we ask Muslim Americans if they think that the quality of life in this country is better for Muslims than it is in other Muslim countries. And overwhelmingly, 2/3 say yes. 66% say life here is better for Muslims than it is typically in other parts of the world. And only 8% say that life here is worse than it is in other parts of the world. Now, lest you think that this is all a Pollyanna story, it's not. There certainly are problems, and for a discussion of what Muslim Americans have been experiencing, especially on the topics that are subject here today, I'll turn it over to Greg.
All right. Well, it's certainly a very important finding of the survey that Muslims in the United States are well integrated, well assimilated, and largely quite happy with their lives in the United States. But as Scott alluded to, the survey also shows that that's really only part of the story. Muslims living in the United States also face real challenges, real problems, real difficulties, and the survey helps to tease out what some of those challenges and difficulties are. When we ask Muslim Americans to tell us in their own words about the most important problems facing the Muslim American community, the theme that emerges is one of intolerance, discrimination, and ignorance. Nearly 3 in 10 Muslim Americans tell us that negative views towards Muslims on the part of non-Muslims is among the most serious problems facing the Muslim American community. In a similar vein, 20% cite discrimination, prejudice, and unfair treatment as major problems. 15% tell us that there's a lot of ignorance of Islam and that this is very problematic. And then 7% cite religious and cultural problems between Muslims and non-Muslims. Another thing that's striking about this question and about the findings on this question is what we didn't find. Relatively few respondents mentioned jobs or the economy. Large numbers of any other population, when asked this question, would be likely to cite something about the economy as highly problematic. But that's not what we see here. And it's not that Muslims aren't feeling economic pain, just like many other groups. It's just not what they wanted to talk about. We also didn't find much here in the way of citation of intra-religious problems and difficulties and misunderstandings among the Muslim American community. Rather, the focus was really on the challenges posed by reaching understanding between Muslims and non-Muslims. The survey also shows that many Muslims have had concrete experiences, concrete negative experiences with discrimination and hostility. Upwards of 1 in 4 tell us that over the past 12 months, they've been treated with suspicion because of their religion. Upwards of 1 in 5 say that they have been called offensive names, and a similar number says that they've been singled out by airport security. Upwards of 1 in 10 tell us that they've been singled out by other kinds of law enforcement, and about 1 in 20 say that they've been physically threatened or attacked because of their religion. If you add all of this up, we find that something more than 4 out of 10 Muslim Americans have experienced at least one of these events just over the past 12 months. This is kind of a, you might look at this as sort of a glass half empty, glass half full story in this sense. We asked these same questions in 2007. And it's encouraging, I suppose, that we really haven't seen any uptick in people's reported experiences with these kinds of things. We also see that fewer than half of Muslims say that they've experienced one or more of these kinds of things, which means most Muslims haven't experienced these things. At the same time, the glass half empty part of this is that even though these numbers haven't gone up since 2007, we also haven't seen any appreciable decrease. They've really held steady. And you can also see that that 4 in 10 number, though less than a majority, is certainly a very significant minority. These kinds of negative experiences are more common among some subgroups of Muslim Americans than among others. Younger Muslims, for instance, are far more likely than their older counterparts to say that they've experienced one of these things. In fact, more than half of Muslims under the age of 30 say that they've been through something like this. The survey also finds that Muslims who are highly religious, those who say they attend mosque regularly, that they pray at least 5 times every day, and who say that religion is very important in their lives, very religious Muslims are more likely to experience these kinds of things than are those who are less religious. Muslim Americans mostly feel like they don't get a fair shake from the media. 55% tell us that coverage of Muslims and Islam by the American news media is generally unfair, compared with only 30% who say that media coverage of Islam is fair. The survey also finds that most Muslim Americans, 55%, say that it's become more difficult to be a Muslim in the United States since the events of September 11th, 2001. And a similar number, 52%, think that the government's anti-terrorism policies single out Muslim Americans for extra scrutiny. Only 1/3 of Muslims say they don't think the Muslim community is singled out by government anti-terrorism policies. Clearly, then, many Muslims feel that the Muslim community in the United States faces a significant amount of discrimination, misunderstanding, and scrutiny from the broader public and even from the government. One concrete way that these kinds of challenges have been manifested recently, and something that was discussed in the previous panel, is in the controversies over the building of mosques and Islamic cultural centers, both in New York City, but also in many other places around the country. The survey provides what I think are some interesting new data on these topics. And beyond the survey, I'd like to point out that the Pew Research Center has some resources on these kinds of controversies that might be informative to you. First, the survey, for example, the survey had a battery of really interesting questions about the proposal to build a mosque and Islamic cultural center near the site of the World Trade Center in New York City. First, we asked Muslims how much they'd heard about this issue, and not surprisingly, the vast majority, upwards of 8 in 10, had at least some familiarity with this, saying they'd heard at least a little bit about it. Next, we followed up, and we asked those who'd heard about the proposal to build the mosque and cultural center what they thought about it. We began by asking whether or not they thought construction should be allowed, and nearly 3/4 of those who'd heard something about the issue said, yes, I do think that this should be permitted, this should be allowed to be built. Then, we asked those who said that construction should be allowed a second question, whether or not they thought it was a good idea or a bad idea to go forward with the construction. Most of them, half of all of the Muslims who'd heard about the issue, said yes, they think that building the mosque and the cultural center is a good idea. And you can see here that Muslims are much more likely than the general public to say that the building of the mosque should be allowed and that its construction is a good idea. But I was really struck by the significant amount of ambivalence toward the project expressed by the Muslims that we interviewed. Though most of them think that construction should be permitted, and half say that this is a good idea, you can see here that over 1/3 expressed reservations, either saying that it shouldn't be allowed to be built at all, or even if this should be permitted, we really don't think it's a great idea. Though the controversy over the New York City Mosque and Cultural Center has figured prominently in the media in recent months, comparatively few Muslims say that these kinds of issues have cropped up in their own communities. Upwards of 8 in 10 Muslims tell us that there's been no opposition to the building of mosques in the communities where they live, or that there hasn't been a proposal where they live to build a new mosque in recent years, compared with 14% of Muslims who tell us that there has been opposition to the building of mosques or Islamic cultural centers in their communities. We know, however, that controversies over mosque construction have popped up all over the country in recent years. And to help provide some context for these controversies, the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life has prepared a web page, which is displayed here, that includes pinpoints on a map that you can click on to find out more about each of a number of controversies that have popped up, about their background, the specifics, and some of the circumstances surrounding each of these controversies. I think this can help to illuminate the social and cultural context in which Muslims are making their way in the United States today. Now, we've covered a lot of ground here in this necessarily brief overview of some of the highlights from the survey. There's a lot more information in the full report, which you can download from our website, www.pewresearch.org. I've highlighted the problems and the challenges that are faced by Muslim Americans, but let me just end with a reminder that we shouldn't lose sight of the material that Scott opened with. Though the survey documents the challenges faced by Muslim Americans, it also shows that relatively few Muslims perceive the American people as a whole as fundamentally unfriendly toward Muslims and Islam. Instead, most Muslims say that they think the American people in general are either friendly or neutral toward Muslim Americans. And this highlights, I think, and brings home that though there are significant challenges and problems, this is also a group that on the whole is largely assimilated, well integrated, and basically happy with their lives here in the United States. I hope that the information and the material that we've covered is helpful and informative, and I know I speak for Scott when I say we'll look forward to trying to respond to some of your questions.
Great, we have about 5 minutes, so if you can hand any questions down to the center, we can answer as many of those as we can. I have one question for you. Reading the report, there was a statistic about the number of people who had expressed support for a Muslim in the past year. The people reported, so I've been called a name, but then they also reported people expressing support. And the sound reminded me of what Jim Zogby was saying about how he felt they were being under attack, but the gratuitous, also people outpouring support. What was the question that was asked, and how did that play out?
You want to take that?
Sure. Well, in the same battery of questions where we asked about whether people had experienced discrimination, had they been treated with suspicion, had they been called offensive names, we also asked in that same battery whether or not Muslims had people reach out to them and express support for them because of their religion over the past 12 months. And we found a large number, upwards of 1/3, who told us, yes, this is something that they experienced. And I think this goes along well with the entire picture of the survey's findings, that this is in many ways an on the one hand, on the other type of story. There's a significant number of people who have experienced negative events, negative interactions with others, but at the same time, that's not the whole story. There's also lots of support, lots of outreach, and lots of kind expressions toward Muslims on the part of the general public as well.
A question we get is, what is the latest ethnic background of American Muslims? So how does it break down, and any trends that you see there?
Sure. I mentioned that this is still a very largely immigrant population. We asked people who were not born in the United States, where were you born? And among the foreign-born, 41% come to the U.S. from the Middle East region or North Africa, 14% from Pakistan, 12% from other parts of South Asia, about 5% from Iran, and then a scattering of people who came from Europe or from sub-Saharan Africa. So of all the individual countries represented by people in the survey, and I believe we found upwards of 80 different countries.
I think it was 77.
77 different countries represented just among the people that we interviewed. Pakistan was the single largest at 14%.
Great. And what do you see in terms of anti-Muslim sentiment? Anything you pick up in the trends in your polling?
Well, a couple of points were made in the previous session. First of all, it is true that the public, the general public, is more negative about Islam and Muslims if they're not identified as Muslim Americans than about Muslim Americans. So that's true. And there has been some uptick, but actually overall we're not finding a significantly different level of anti-Muslim sentiment now than we did earlier. It's actually fluctuated. I mean, one thing that we did find in our polling immediately in the aftermath of 9/11 is that there was a very clear sense in the data that President Bush's statements to not blame all Muslims, to make distinctions and not lay upon the Muslim American population the responsibility for what happened in 9/11 seemed to actually make a difference, because the groups that became more favorable to Muslim Americans in the aftermath of 9/11 were actually the most conservative Republicans who had had the most negative views beforehand. So we made an inferential leap there, that there certainly was evidence that the audience, part of the audience that the president was speaking to at that time, much of his political base, took it to heart.
Great. And could you fill out the Muslim versus Muslim Americans? Because I think in your poll it was like a 15 or 20% difference.
Yeah, I don't have the number right in front of me, so rather than make it up, I'll just say that sounds like the ballpark. Does that seem right to you, Greg, from what you remember?
I think so.
Yeah. So it's a sizable difference.
And the question you asked was favorability towards Muslims or favorability
as
towards
toward Muslim Americans, and you give that to different random samples within a survey, so that you're not asking people to rate both of them side by side. Yeah.
Well, this has been a fantastic introduction, and people can find more on your website and with these printed reports, and we really appreciate you coming out today.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we'll go right into our next panel.